Welcome back, everyone, to Context for Chaos, and we are on our second to last interview of the interviews that we've lined up. And this is with Mark Horn. This is when we talked about his book, Gates of Light, in 2023, and we talked about his religious perspectives, his spirituality, his adventures in life, his losses in life, and this is one of the most touching interviews I've done, so I'm excited for all of you to hear it. And if you are just tuning in now, Jessica and I will be starting our own journey of this podcast after these last two interviews. So if you're enjoying Context for Chaos and are enjoying the episodes where Jessica and I are interviewing the person that I interviewed in 2023, then you will really enjoy what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned, and we're excited for this shift, and I'm extremely excited to reintroduce Mark to all of you. So here is 2023 me introducing Mark Horn. Mark Horn is the author of Tarot and the Gates of Light, a Kabbalistic path to liberation. He may be the only person who has taught at both the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Reader's Studio International Tarot Conference. Mark has studied Kabbalah with academic, rabbinic, and practical teachers in organizations ranging from the highly respected to the highly unorthodox. And he has studied tarot with many of today's most respected authorities on the subject. He offers readings and classes online. Hello, Mark. Thank you for granting me your time, your precious time, to come onto my show. I'm so glad you could make it.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always an honor to be asked.
So, Mark, you have a book out called Tarot and the Gates of Light, and it explains a very interesting and enlightening practice with tarot cards, and we're definitely going to talk about that. But I want to ask a bit about your life first, so we can all get to know who you are behind this practice. In your introduction, you spoke about your spiritual journey and how it led you away from Judaism toward Buddhism and then back to Judaism. So my first question is, why did you feel the need to leave Judaism in the first place? What pushed you to seek elsewhere?
It's fairly common, I think, among people who are in the tarot world that in one way or another, we're all seekers. And oftentimes, the more conventional paths don't speak to us for one reason or another, so we find ourselves on other paths, sometimes paths that others have forged ahead, such as Wicca or various kinds of pagan paths, which are very popular today, or searching on our own. I walked away from Judaism fairly young because I knew I was gay. And, this was in the 60s, and really most faith communities were not welcoming of alternate sexual expressions. So I decided to search for a spiritual path. Since I was a spiritual kid, I figured there must be some place where I would be at home. So I started looking, and among the things that I came across along the way were tarot cards, and that was something that seemed to be free of dogma and also seemed to be a way inside, because it wasn't really so much about a belief system or a faith tradition, even though it came out of Western traditions, but it really seemed to be a technology to work with your inner soul.
That's very true. You can use tarot to reflect on your emotions, visualize different paths forward, and access a greater understanding of yourself and even your purpose here. Is that something that you would say that a lot of us are looking for when we pull cards?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Can you talk about what it feels like to be a spiritual seeker? I think a lot of people who listen to my podcast are spiritual seekers, but some of them may not know how to translate that into words. And I know it was hard for me to explain, and because of that, I think I stumbled in the dark for longer than I wanted to. So, what are we craving? What are we trying to connect to? What is it that the oneness that we're trying to feel?
I think it's very much an individual thing. I knew that there was a deeper experience of reality and that there was a greater meaning to the world around that I just didn't know how to connect with. And I found the explanations provided by organized religion to be lacking. It didn't speak to my soul. It didn't answer the deeper questions. It only engendered more questions for me. I had any number of rabbis and eventually gurus who said to me, oh, no, we don't go down there. We don't ask those questions. That's not important. And, some of the things the Buddha doesn't talk about, all kinds of things, because the Buddha's teaching was, I'm here to sort of end your suffering. Everything else is really extraneous to what I want to teach. So if you want to know what happens after death, well, there are a whole bunch of people who believe all of these things. And I can tell you if I've experienced past lives, but I'm not here to talk about this. I'm here to free you. And anything else is just sort of getting lost in the weeds. And I understand that because when I walked away from Judaism as a teen, eventually I found my way to Buddhism. And I found it to be a very rich, meaningful experience because it's not so much a teaching as it is a practice. And it's a meditative practice with very specific techniques that you can learn whether you decide to actually believe all of the mythology around Buddhism or not. The technique is, to use my teacher's own words, non-sectarian. If you're just following your breath or paying attention to what's happening in your body, that doesn't have any connection to Judaism or Christianity or Buddhism or Taoism or Zoroastrianism. It's simply observation. And anything we put on top of that is story. But part of what we're here to free ourselves from is story. Because stories can keep us trapped. They're not necessarily reality. As I began to learn all of these things in Buddhism, I began to actually recognize the very same deeper teachings in Judaism. I just never met a rabbi who understood or taught those things. But I went off in search of one, and I found communities full of them. They were just not available to me growing up in Brooklyn in the 1960s.
Yeah, that's very important to remember. You couldn't be open about a lifestyle or opinions that were contrary to the beliefs of whatever organized religion you were a part of. That was a no-go for a long time. Everything's been explained. You don't need to look into anything.
Right.
You know what's expected of you. Now just go along with it like a good little human. But tarot gives you, or any of these practices, I think, like you said, give you your own storytelling, your own kind of way into yourself and your place in the grand design. Like, if you think about the way the major arcana cards are taught is usually by walking through the Fool's Journey, which, is the Fool meeting the other 21 cards one by one. And the Fool's Journey is also said to be everyone's journey through these big spiritual manifestations throughout our lifetimes. Kind of the same way these gigantic stories and these religious texts were about people facing these massive spiritual situations. So tarot, for someone who doesn't come from a religious background and who needs the symbology to help connect the spiritual dots, or someone who is turning away from their religious background but still longs for a spiritual conversation or presence in their life, tarot can give you that.
Exactly. One of the things, I just actually posted something on Instagram today about the Page of Cups, because I look at the Page of Cups and I connect it to two stories. The story of Joseph in the Hebrew Bible, because Joseph used a cup for divination. And in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, there's a little fish peeking out of that cup, speaking to the page, and it's sort of a symbol of connecting to the unconscious. And so that connected to me to the story of Joseph's cup. And in fact, cups and goblets were used, certainly by Jews and probably by other people, for divination for, centuries. And then, of course, I thought about the story from Grimm's Tales, The Fisherman and His Wife. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. It's a story with many variants in India, in Japan, in South America. But it is, as many stories, folk tales are, it comes out of an archetypal pattern that we all connect with. And I looked at this card and I said, yes, that's the story of the fisherman and his wife. And there are times when actually connecting that story to when we're doing a tarot reading, that story may have meaning in the context of that reading. There's a story I tell when the Fool comes up. Actually, there are several stories that come up when the Fool appears in a reading. There's a story of the Baal Shem Tov stepping off of a mountain and what happens to him. And that's exactly what you're seeing in the image of the Fool. But I also talk about images in popular culture. So you can think, when you look at the Fool stepping off of the mountain, you can think of Neo in The Matrix stepping off of a building, expecting to fall and hoping he will actually end up on the next building. Or the Roadrunner who goes off a mountain but keeps running and doesn't fall, but the coyote who chases him and gets halfway across and then looks down and thinks, uh-oh, I'm out of here, and falls. And this directly relates to the idea in The Fool of the belief that there is a power, a greater power in the universe that will hold you up. But if you aren't connected to that power, if you don't believe that power, down you go. And it comes out in all kinds of places in our culture. And because I think it is a universal truth. And when we can sort of connect it to these stories, I think it becomes more real for people, strangely enough.
I completely agree, especially because it is so entrenched in our culture, organized religions, archetypes, and storytelling. Everything is trying to explain or become one with different forces that are greater than us, that can help and sometimes turn against us. And there's so many parallels you can draw in that way between tarot and these old texts. So let's continue on with your life a little bit. You talk about your journey to Japan and how you were introduced to Vipassana meditation. Why were you in Japan? What was the motivation to move there in the first place?
So I was in Japan, actually, because I was employed there. I took a job to work in Japan. Although when I arrived there, literally within a month of arriving, I met a man I was with for 10 years. And man, I think I was the great love of my life. And he said, you know why you came here, right? And I said, well, I came here for a job. He said, no, you came here to meet me. And he said, we have known each other in other lives. We've been together before. We will be together again. This is a karmic connection. And years later, when we were separated and living in different countries, he was back in Japan, I was back in the States, he said, I always feel connected to you. I always know what you're feeling and what's going on. I'm not somebody who has those feelings generally, but when he died, I knew.
Thank you for joining us, and until next time, as above, so below, blessed be.